Hello, random stranger. It is time to get back into the dark world of Fate Zero. But before we get to the recap and go through some of the comments from last time, a few of you noticed that there have been some missing scenes in the version that I've been watching, and that is because VRV, which is the streaming service I've been using up until this point, only has the edited down TV version of Fate. So I did a bit of digging around, and we're going to be switching over to Funimation, which I believe has the full uncut versions of the episodes. So yeah, actually we are also now, I am going to catch up on that Seibari scene that you guys were also telling me about. So yeah, here we go.
俺が現世で望むのは前世で叶わなかった中節の道。もうあんな悲運を繰り返したくない。しかし
Those two have so many things in common. She's not as naive as they made her out to be in the first couple of episodes. I mean, she's not naive, but she is idealistic. Oh. Still has this idea that it's a proxy war, that the servants will take care of most of the fights, but that's really not the case. I mean, Araseal's just like, what a beautiful, but just too perfect dream. She's listening though, Araseal. It's kind of just letting Saber let it all out. She knows exactly what to say to Saber to get her on board. Oh, and then this is where Ryder's like having a laugh and a beer with Grandpa. I love him so much. Okay, that was a super important scene, at least to me, and I don't know why they'd cut it out. But anyway, I mean, what I think that scene showed is that Saber, as I said, is not as naive as she has been portrayed to be. I think she understands Kiritsugu at a very deep level. She gets his whole cost-benefit analysis, the weighing of lives and deciding which lives to sacrifice in order to save more. And she understands that, having done that as a king in her own lifetime. It's just that she doesn't want to do it that way anymore. So she has been exactly where Kiritsugu is right now, but Saber, having made great sacrifices as King Arthur and spent others' lives, like, you know how we're always seeing her in the midst of that battlefield of dead soldiers? So she's done all of that. She sacrificed many lives, and yet she still ended up losing Britain, like her kingdom. And so I guess now, with the benefit of hindsight, she's like, you're not guaranteed victory, even if you are absolutely ruthless and pay a huge cost and send others to die for you, or make that calculation to sacrifice a lot of lives in order to win more. So her thinking now, having experienced all of that, is why not take the small victories that you can? Given the choice, she now, before her, has a chance to save a couple of dozen kids' lives from Castor. And that is like a very concrete victory for her. And I guess that to her, given her failures in the past, is worth more than anything. And so that is why she has never seen eye to eye with Kiritsugu. It's not that she doesn't understand what he's trying to do. It's that she's done it all and still failed. And so she's like, hey, come on, let's just take the victories we can. Which makes a lot of sense, actually. And it kind of, man, no more skip scenes anymore, because I feel like it just rounded out Saber's approach and why she's just at every turn seems to object to Kiritsugu's way of doing things, to explain that a lot more. It was also interesting that from Saber's perspective, the point of having servants to fight the Holy Grail War is to minimize bloodshed, which Caster is blatantly violating, and Kiritsugu doesn't seem to understand or agree with. So that, I guess, on top of the whole immorality of murdering kids, is yet another reason that Saber wants to end Caster. When she said that if Kiritsugu hadn't engaged Cainith in a fight, that her and Lancer would have been able to finish off Caster and then afterwards been able to finish off their own fight. I get it, but also I feel Cainith would have brought the fight to Kiritsugu anyway, so her view of things kind of paints over details like that. And I think it was actually smart for Kiritsugu to have taken advantage of Cainith's overconfidence and the fact that he'd stepped onto Ainsburn's property, which is essentially their home ground. So they have, home advantage. Finally, I really liked the parallel of Irisville having a chat to Saber, also again at the top of the castle with Saber, just like Kiritsugu had been looking out from the castle ramparts, and same setup with Irisville coming up from behind to talk to them. Yeah, I really feel for Irisville having to negotiate with these two who are at such loggerheads with each other. But what was different also about this scene, though, is that instead of Irisville offering her complete support to Kiritsugu in his moment of just utter desperation, here she was more letting Saber know that both she and Kiritsugu needed her. And yeah, that got through to Saber. I know the scene where Ryder and Waver scope out Caster's lab also had a few extra bits, but I'm going to skip over those because I just don't really have a strong stomach for those kinds of scenes. So that means we can get to the recap now. So let's travel back to episode 9, which opened with Lance's backstory as seen through Cainith's dreams, oddly enough, in a tale as old as time. Lancer, as Diarmuid, a knight of Fianna, had an affair with his leader's betrothed, Graine, who was the daughter of the king. And immediately there's this fascinating parallel between Lancer and Saber's stories, assuming that Saber's backstory follows the infamous French version of the Arthurian legend, in which one of Saber's most famous knights, so Lancelot, had an affair with King Arthur's wife, Guinevere. And so that jump-started like a tragic series of events that then led to the Knights of the Round Table splitting and, taking sides, and then Arthur leaving to start a war with Lancelot, which opened up a way for his nephew/son, Mordred, just gave him a chance to usurp the throne, which then leads to the final Battle of Camlan, which of course is where Arthur supposedly was struck and died, or who knows, was carried off to Avalon and just disappeared. So that is something really significant that connects Saber and Lancer. Both have suffered from and regret, I guess, how personal desires have trumped loyalty and honor and led to the destruction of some really important relationships to them. And in Arthur's case, led to eventually the destruction of their entire kingdom. But Lancer, by contrast, comes from the perspective of the knight who betrayed their lord, while Saber dealt with the difficulty of having to punish a knight who followed her for their betrayal. So it's like they're kind of coming from the same story but from the opposite ends. And although, King Arthur did not seek revenge in the roundabout way that Lance's leader did, by pretending to accept the relationship and then stabbing him in the back. Well, not in the back, but you know what I mean. Yeah, King Arthur instead just straight up fought a war against Lancelot. I also wouldn't be surprised if the parallels between Diarmuid's and Lancelot's stories are a result of, because one is inspired by the other. Chronologically, I'm not sure which legend came first, because Lancelot was an addition to the Arthurian legend by the French authors in like around the 11th century, 10th or 11th, somewhere around there. And the earliest copies, written copies that we have of Diarmuid's legend are dated around the same time. But the parallels are interesting, especially as in Fate Zero, Saber and Lanza have established like a real rapport with each other, even as they are honor bound to kill the other. It's like even in this iteration of their existence, they just can't escape that tragic vortex of one being pitted against the other, even though they are connected by these really strong bonds of like the chivalric code and the honor that exists between a king and their knight. Let's talk about Kenneth's predicament after his magical circuits were wrecked by Kiritsugu's soul bullets. He can't practice magic anymore, and he is at the total mercy of Soloui, who had him strapped down in this horror hospital-like scene and was caring for him like she was some kind of psychotic nurse. And the way that she whispered, "Don't cry, Kenneth," kind of gave me real shivers. And so she's comforting Kenneth by saying all these things about how all they need to do is win the Grail War so they can wish for his full restoration. And it's really all just a sly setup to get him to give up his command seals over to her so that she can become Lance's sole master. And she will take it by force if she has to, and she does, because she ended up just doing that awful finger bending, snapping thing, even though technically you can only give up your command seals through voluntary consent, which made me think that the Grail contracts themselves are pretty basic, or actually quite shit, because by normal legal standards, Kenneth would have given up his command seals under duress, and so Soloui's assumption of sole master status of Lancer should have been void. But I guess the Grail can't detect that level of nuance or that level of duress, so even if Kenneth did end up giving over his command seals because Soloui snapped off his fingers, that was considered voluntary consent, which, again, just need to overlook that little bit of legal shittery that's going on. In a display that showed Kenneth genuinely values Soloui's affections for whatever reason, he desperately warned her about falling under the spell of Lance's mole and wants her to know that he isn't as admirable as he's making himself out to be. Interestingly, he also mentioned Lancer had told him that he wasn't interested at all in the Grail. And if Lancer did say that, I think there are two ways to read it. Firstly, I imagine Lancer does want the Grail to try and reverse his betrayal or wish for another outcome to his affair with Grian, but was too ashamed to share that with Kenneth, because obviously Kenneth is not the most sympathetic of guys. However, I do think the second possible reading is more likely, and that is that Lancer isn't interested in the Grail for his own sake. It's more that he has this very deep desire to redeem himself by proving his loyalty to his lord, who happens to be Kenneth, almost so he can rid himself, or I guess mitigate the shame from his previous life. And part of his reluctance to take on Soloui as his master, or sole master, was also because he saw Grian in her, and the way his mole has twisted her perception of him such that he knows that she would betray Kenneth at the drop of a pin, for him. And that is the very thing that he wants to avoid and do over. Although at this stage, it's probably a bit too late because Soloui is clearly not acting in Kenneth's best interests. We should talk about the conversation between Soloui and Lancer. Soloui playing the role of traitor just very well by trying to convince Lancer that it's better if they win the war together for the sake of Kenneth's health. But Lancer is stubborn, as knights tend to be, and I thought his line that he is a knight before he is a servant was very telling and profound. that these spirits, they are summoned to fight a war on behalf of their masters, but they're also summoned in the fullness of their original personalities and their wants and their loyalties. And for most of them, the Grail is just a means for them to achieve their ends or their goals. They won't compromise who they are for their masters unless they are forced to by the command seals. And that is what I guess fascinates me most about Fate. It's that the servants have just as much conflict and individual resolve as any of the masters. I couldn't help but get a sense that Lancer is naive in a similar way to Saber, and it might just be a Knight thing, because he accepted without question that Soloui did her best to try and heal Kenneth, and he also accepted her swearing that she has no other motive other than to bring the Grail to Kenneth, as if a solemn swear is good enough for him, like good enough proof that it's almost like he couldn't comprehend that someone would do that just to manipulate him. Or maybe he does know, but he just has no choice but to act in accordance with the etiquette that his honor code lays out. Next is the continued just fascinating dynamics between Saber, Arisville, and Kiritsugu. There was a rare request from Saber to Arisville asking her to try and convince Kiritsugu to let her go after Caster, because she's concerned, and rightly so, that more kids are going to get murdered. But Arisville knows Kiritsugu well enough to know that he won't budge on that. She still, however, gave Saber just a really soft look that said, "You sweet, sweet summer child," for asking such a thing. I think because Arisville appreciates the good things in life, things like vacations and mountain drifting, the goodness that Saber radiates in a really dank world where people do horrible things to each other, that makes Saber very appealing to Arisville. And at the same time, though, Arisville does occupy that middle ground between Saber and Kiritsugu. Like, she, unlike Saber, is more willing to compromise to achieve the kind of world that she envisions. And because she shares that vision with Kiritsugu, she is more willing to sort of overlook some of the things that he is more prone to do. You know, the more questionable, the morally questionable stuff. As expected, Kiritsugu has just moved on and is already calculating their next steps. The way that he inquired after Maya was done in just a purely pragmatic way for the purpose of knowing when she can be useful to them again. He'd also already predicted that Saber would ask to disagree with him and prioritize killing Caster over going after Kenneth. And so he is just going to go and act on his own without keeping Saber in on the loop. The other interesting bit with this conversation was when Arisville asked if he was mad at Saber for letting Lancer go, because she cares about things like relationships and how well Saber and Kiritsugu are getting along with each other. And I just don't think Kiritsugu gets mad. He just readjusts his calculus. Or if he does get mad on the inside, he has just mastered putting a super tight lid on it because he knows that emotion won't help him win this war. That is not to say that he is going to forget what Saber did. He clearly thought that it was a grave mistake and jeopardized his entire mission, and he trusts her even less now than he did before, which wasn't much to begin with, which is why he's going out on his own now. And I have to say that I agree more with Kiritsugu's judgment on this issue than Saber's. Even though I am 100% morally aligned with Saber, I'm pretty much an Arisville. Like, I have empathy for both Kiritsugu and Saber's goals and understand where each of them are coming from, and kind of feel like caught in between the two, even though I will go Kiritsugu's way because I think he does have generally the right idea. I also wonder, just given how these conversations went down, if Kiritsugu's starting to regret summoning Saber. Not that he'll dwell on it, because he's always like, okay, what's the next step, given the current circumstances. But yeah, she was meant to be one of the more powerful servants, but now not only is her left hand still out of function, but she has been shown to be a wild card in terms of acting against Kiritsugu's well-laid plans. What a change in tone it was when we hard cut to Ryder enjoying a good old drink with the brainwashed granddad. And it seems like he has just fully embraced being able to walk around in physical form again and wear pants and a shirt. And I remember how we talked about how servants don't really need to eat or drink, but they can derive a certain pleasure from those things if they choose to. And Ryder is exactly the type to be like, well, why the hell not? Why not eat and drink and have sex and wage war when you can? And I always enjoy Waver's look of utter despair and just exasperation whenever Ryder does things he sees as just going off mission. But something tells me that when this war ends, and I'm presuming that Ryder's not around anymore, that Waver's going to miss the banter and even just the reality of having someone to roll his eyes at. Waver proven that he does have a little noggin inside that skull of his, so he got Ryder to collect water samples so that they could pinpoint the source of magic and then find Caster. And I appreciated Ryder's appreciation of Waver and his methods, because Waver was a little bit apprehensive at being complimented by Ryder at first, but Ryder was genuinely proud of his practicality, even though it's not something that a quote-unquote mage would do. And Ryder, as King Alexander, would know to appreciate simple yet practical and effective solutions, because it recalls the legend of Alexander and the Gordian knot. So it's like, why trouble yourself with complicated plans when there is a way to slice right through to the problem? The evolution of Ryder and Waver's partnership continues to be really satisfying. We have gone from a relationship that was quite heavily skewed towards Ryder's combat abilities and ambition, with Waver sort of tagging along and seemingly being a really weak master, to now a much more balanced partnership where Waver provides a lot of the brains of their operations. Not that this is a muscle and a brain kind of situation. Like, Ryder is freaking King Alexander, so he's not just all muscle. He may have like a different strategic approach to Waver, but that is why their relationship or their partnership works so well. They're sort of starting to feed off each other's ideas, and as a result, they are becoming a much stronger master-servant pair. Also worth noting was how Ryder's pride for Waver spurred him on, and how that in turn embarrasses Waver, but you can see that he's warming up to Ryder a lot. And I think that reflects the legend of Alexander the Great, who, in addition to his military successes, was recorded as being particularly gifted at inspiring loyalty in his soldiers. And he apparently ate with them and refused to take any privileges that weren't available to them, and also, fought alongside them in battle. So Iskander's, or Alexander's, just natural ability to connect with his people, I think explains like the bro vibes that we've been getting between Waver and Ryder. So BP Chua78 in a comment wrote that from the light novel, the scene inside the sewers that was not shown is the grotesque artwork of the children that were kidnapped by Caster and Ryunosuke, with them still being alive while having their bodies mutilated. Yeah, so I'm pretty happy to not have witnessed that. I just think it would have taken a while to scrub that image from my memory. So that kind of worked out there with the skip scenes. I did enjoy watching Ryder, though, go on a total roadkill rampage and seeing Waver actually start to enjoy himself, maybe, and get infected with Ryder's lust for war and for adventure. But of course, the mood immediately got killed by what they discovered in Caster's lair. And you could tell that something wasn't quite right by the inflection in Ryder's tone and the shadows that was cast over his face and his eyes when he urged Waver not to look. Ryder's outrage and Waver's horror at the scene only added to how much I like them both, because it's kind of proof of their underlying humanity. Ryder just deriding anyone who could have no reaction of disgust to the scene before them and the murder of children in that way made me wonder, I guess, how Kiritsugu would have reacted to that carnage. One would think that he would play the stoic on the outside, but on the inside be thrown up just as much as Waver or Ryder, given his deep hate for the suffering of innocence. We know that on a theoretical level, he's okay to not prioritize going after Caster because he's done his whole weighing what would yield the greater good thing. But I think there is room to speculate how being confronted visually with the sight and the smell of these mangled kids could have potentially changed his view and his calculus. So the assassins arrived and were going to move in for the ambush, but then for some reason they end up just slinking back into the shadows again. And we saw Ryder's strategic mind at work. He isn't some big brash idiot, but he is an actual, gifted, seasoned strategist who knows whether a battlefield favors them or not and when it is smart to withdraw. I also loves when Waver hesitated to just leave without doing something about this torture chamber with the kids still, still clinging to life. So they ended up torching the entire place, partly to slow Caster down, but also there's this wordless agreement between Waver and Ryder that it is all so horrific that it's just better to wipe the place off the face of the earth. Instead of what they could have done, which is hunt for more clues to potentially gain some sort of advantage. So instead of that, they agreed to burn the whole thing down. And again, that joint decision by the both of them really increased my respect for those two. So episode 9 ended with the phone conversation between Kirei and his teacher Tokiyomi, which I believe is just another interaction that is pushing Kirei towards betraying Tokiyomi. And I think that because when Tokiyomi was telling Kirei to maintain his confidence and his elegance and the whole battles should be fought with dignity thing, you could almost hear Kirei's eyes rolling into the back of his head. One, it is just such a stuffy, idealized version of the war that they're engaging in. And two, it is borderline, if not actually hypocritical, of Tokiyomi to speak of dignity, given how so far, well, since the beginning, they've been operating in the shadows and relied on cheating. So Tokiyomi may believe what he's saying, or is able to use the ends to justify the means, but in practice, his old family mage ideals increasingly feel like this thin veneer that covers the fact that he's just like any of the other masters with his own selfish desires, no matter how much he may want to come across as pursuing a higher purpose than everyone else. Okay, Rin's big adventure was a peculiar detour. So from Mr. Galdor 123. Rin's episode is, I believe, mostly fan service. She is one of the major characters in Fate Stay Night, all three routes, and also very popular. So it's kind of cool to see her as a little girl here, even though I find it a bit unrealistic that everything went so well for her. Agreed. I totally get why Rin would be a popular character. I thought that the episode succeeded in establishing a couple of things. Rin as a character is hugely likable and ambitious. She is gifted and smart, but also humble. Like she's not, her head's not so big that she can't see or be decent to other people. She has a strong sense of justice, and even at her age, she had a way with people that endears her to them. And I know, as the main character of Fate Stay, it would have had huge nostalgic value for people who'd watched that already. This episode also filled in some gaps in Tokiyomi's character, who up until this point, we've only seen really as, yes, an extremely competent mage, but also a slightly condescending one who spouts all these very lofty ideals, and who, as far as we know, had no issues with giving away one of his own daughters to another mage family. And not just a mage family, but the Mators, who I'm assuming his brand of magic is pretty well known amongst the mages. It was, presumably a calculated choice on Tokiyomi's part to ensure her future as a mage or to expand the prestige or the connections of the Tosaka family. But still, judged by a less utilitarian and a more humane standpoint, it was still a pretty shitty thing for a father to have done to his own kid. And so this is where I want to bring in Neron Kaiser's comment, whose name I think I can pronounce now, which just gave some really good insight into how to balance Tokiyomi's very conflicting character traits and actions. They wrote, when looking at Tokiyomi's mage-like yet warm attitude to Rin, it's also good to remember he's the same guy who gave up Sakura to Matos, knowing full well what she's going to go through there and how inhuman their magecraft is. The light novel underlines it strongly. He's got zero qualms over this. It makes you really despise him. In his mind, whatever suffering Sakura goes through with the Matos is still less horrible than the thought of her never practicing magic. This connects back nicely to that scene of Kenneth crying when Solo Ui says you'll never cast a spell again. For both him and Tokiyomi and most mages, magecraft is the sole purpose and value in life. I guess. So when it comes to how Tokiyomi treats his family, it's not as straightforward as saying Tokiyomi is like a cold-hearted bastard of a father who bargained away his own daughter, because the way he is with Rin shows that, though, he's not going to be winning any Father of the Year awards, but he does genuinely care in some way for his family. For example, he made those plans for her safety for the duration of the Grail War. He didn't get mad at her for opening that cursed book and putting her own life in danger, and instead just gave her a gadget to prevent that from happening in the future. Although, to be fair, he probably should have put that book in a more secure storage place. Anyway, the good parts of Tokiyomi still don't excuse the more questionable ones. But his character presents a complexity that is so real to humans, and that is that people are multifaceted. Just because they treat one person terribly doesn't mean that they're incapable of treating another person really well. Also, one may have good intentions, but also commit terrible acts. So pretty much what he did to Sakura. He intended for her to have a good mage education and the chance to be one, but it ended up just terribly for her. All of that is just like the curse of being human, that we have all these flaws that complicate how one is to judge the contents of our character. Prior to episode 10, we'd mostly seen Tokiyomi through the lens of both Gilgamesh and Kirei, which gave us a hugely unfavorable reading of his character because, as we've already mentioned, he constantly harps on about the dignity of mage battles, despite collaborating with the church to use some objectively underhanded methods to secure the battlefield into their favor. And also, both of them really seem to find him quite the boring dude. But in this episode, we see Tokiyomi apply those same principles of, dignity and control and elegance in a very different context. And that is teaching Rin how to control her mana flow. And we get to understand that his emphasis on always acting with composure and elegance is substantially integrated with how the Tosakas practice magic. It's not just a slogan that he bandies around, but it is a core part of the mage tradition that's been handed down through the generations in their family that has allowed them to harness mana in the proper way. So it was good to see that there is depth behind his lofty sayings, certainly when compared to, for example, how the Matos do magic, which is a far less elegant, much more like destructive way of conceptualizing and practicing magic. if you had to choose between the two ways, the Torsak or the Mato way, then you kind of see, oh, actually elegance and composure and control really do matter in the practice of magic. It also kind of killed me when Tokiomi promised Rin that he'd come back and teach her, I think it was like gem magic after the war is over, because to me that is again just a clear sign that he is gonna be really dead by the end of this war. And if I had to guess how he's gonna die, the way that they're slowly building up Kirei's dislike of him, or just building up his irritation of this supposed teacher of his, and Kirei's restlessness with the church, and Tokiomi's very one-track thinking, Tokiomi is probably going to get blindsided by a betrayal from Kirei, and Kirei is probably going to murder him for being so annoying. Like, that just seems like where they're headed, and I assume that then sets up for the next series, or it was the previous series, but chronologically the next series, a revenge plotline for Rin to come after Kirei. So what happened in Rin's adventure is that Kotone, her friend, disappears from school amidst all of the kidnappings and the murder of kids, including, I think, the kid who was bullying Kotone at the start, like they showed his funeral. So Rin, being the logical kid that she is, decides to go looking for Kotone in Fuyuki in the dark on her own without telling anyone. And, you know, the mana compass that her dad gave her starts going nuts, telling her that there is this powerful magic afoot. And Rin, I mean, she's either really dumb or really brave, or, as is often the case, both. Especially when she started going down these dark alleyways and into abandoned bars. But it is okay because she has got the best kind of armor, which is plot armor. It turns out, of course, that Ryunosuke has been hunting. And he had this bracelet on, gifted to him by Caster, which allowed him to control the kids that he's taking. Thankfully, Rin does actually seem to have the fear gene in her, because at first she is justifiably terrified when she gets discovered by Ryunosuke. But she very quickly recovers and figured out that she needed to break the bracelet in order to free the kids from their petrified state. And it was super impressive that she was able to apply Tokiomi's lesson about controlling her mana in such a high pressure situation like that. However, I did also like that they did not make her completely into an omnipotent kid hero, even though she's basically 90% of the way there, because she did also have outside help from Karia, who I guess we have to assume has been watching over Rin this whole entire time, or like stalking her. Otherwise, it would have been just a very unrealistic sort of coincidence that he happened to be there at the right time when Caster decided to attack. And then, you know, disgustingly, Karia's insects overpower Caster's cursed vines, and then we get that touching scene in the park, which is the same park, I think, where we first saw Rin and her mom. Karia just looked a right mess. The way that he described Mato magic is almost like a selling your soul to the devil type of deal. So you give up your life, presumably to the bugs, in return for power. And out of all the characters, I have the most pity for Karia, because there's just no way that things end happily for him, regardless of how the war turns out. He has no real family to speak of, and there's no one to comfort him or, I guess, fight alongside him, unlike Kiritsugu. And he is not doing this for selfish gain either. His thing is that he promised to save Sakura from a similar fate, which she has already been subject to, but that's besides the point. And like, the only extent to which he's fighting the war for himself is that he seems set on rescuing Sakura as a way to counter that crushing guilt and the self-loathing that's built up for having failed to live up to the Mato family name. And so, you know, he was able to walk away for a while, and he probably had plans to stay out of this war, except he cares so much for the Tosaka girls and clearly feels responsible for his father resorting to claiming one of them. And yeah, so there's just no way this ends well for him. You know, even if he wins the Grail, which is a long shot given the competition that's out there, he has to forfeit his life anyway, because the magic that he needs to win will consume him entirely. And if he loses, he'll either like be dead or have to deal with the worst outcome, which is to live with the knowledge that he failed to save Sakura. The direness of Karia's predicament was just somehow made more sad in the way that he enthusiastically and very hopefully talks about how good his chances are at winning. And, you know, it might be true that Berserker is the strongest servant given the combat skills that we saw a couple of episodes back, where he was more than holding his own even against Gilgamesh and his noble phantasm. But there is like a serious deal breaker or a circuit breaker in the form of Berserker's just crazed outrage against Saber. It's like Kariya was glossing over all the things that could potentially go wrong and has already gone wrong. And on top of that, he's painting a very pretty picture of what the future will hold once the war is over. Ironically, exactly what Tokiomi did when he promised Rin he'd teach her more magic. Kariya, I think, was like, you know, one day we'll play in the park together again. So definitely not a coincidence that the writers made these two characters make similar sorts of promises. And what seals the tragedy of that is that it is extremely unlikely that there is a future where both Tokiomi and Kariya are still alive at the same time, you know, let alone playing happy family or just reliving the former happiness of the past, because they are, as everyone is in this war, pitted against each other. And with how badly they both want the Grail or need the Grail, they're probably going to have to kill each other for it. Which I think is what Aoi was getting at when she asked Kariya, do you want to die? And do you want to take Tokiomi with you? And yeah, that's just the real take. You know, she's cutting through his very idealized, sanitized vision of what things are going to be like after the war. You know, none of them are coming out of this war unscathed. Just that is just the nature of war. Aoi could also have been hinting at how, like, she knows how much Kariya hates Tokiomi for everything he stands for and what he did to Sakura. So she's like, are you really going to look past that? Here's an interesting take on Aoi from Bafflement, which didn't cross my mind until I read this comment. So Aoi seems to be one of those women who is very focused on her status as a wife. To her, being the perfect mage's wife is more important than even her children's well-being. That's part of what Kariya was so horrified about in the first episode, and it's also why she's more concerned here about Kariya wanting to beat Tokiomi than what might happen to Sakura. And if that is the case, that is rock bottom awful. Like, she is so devoted to Tokiomi and the Torasaka name that even though being separated from a daughter, we can assume would have been extremely painful, it was not so painful that it's urged her to stop it from happening. And that sort of passiveness, or that kind of putting a family name above the comfort and the safety of your own daughter, is just incomprehensible to me. One last thing I'm curious about, just based on the very hopeful tone that Rin's episode ended on, you know, she's talking about how much more she has to learn, but that one day, if she tries really hard and works really hard, she'll make it. I mean, obviously this is all coming from a child's perspective, but I did wonder if, compared to Fate Zero, if the other Fate series are less dark in terms of the subjects that they cover or the tone of the whole piece. Yeah, I don't know. And I don't know when I'm going to be able to get to the other Fate series, if ever. So yeah, no worries about spoiling if you want to let me know or give an answer to that question. Okay, episode 11 of Fate Zero, here we go. This is definitely the uncut version. It's like a full 6 minutes longer than the episode over on VRV. So yeah, if you guys are ready to sync this up, let's do it in 3, 2, 1, play. Okay, it's got a couple of logo things at the start, but the subs should be able to be synced with. Saber. She's been standing here just staring out dramatically this whole time. Oh. What does he want? I love these two together. But she would know that Ryder wouldn't attack, right? Because he's gonna honor like the pact that she has with Lancer first. Yeah. Yeah, because despite Ryder being, you know, all like ha 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 and just kind of really carefree, he really does have a pretty strong backbone in terms of honoring, you know, pacts and keeping promises and all that. He is a king after all. Aoi is definitely an interesting character. I do hope we get more of her motivations in future episodes. I love the strings in this. Especially that run up. Actually, Kirei and Kiritsugu do look somewhat similar. Except Kirei is just like totally dead in the eyes. It's the shirt that put them off. Hey, she changed into a full-on armor. Just fully prepared to fight. Is it for real? It's for real. Just like what is happening? Oh my god, this is half of my dream. I hope Lancer shows up, but I don't think he will. I always wanted a drinking party between those three. She's so tiny in comparison to him. Okay. He wants to win this war through dialogue. Is that it? I mean, somehow I don't think that's gonna work, but just gonna drink. King Alexander. Yeah, Grail dialogue, literally. King Alexander versus King Arthur. It's three of them. Well, it's obvious what his ranking would be. It's just him and then everyone else below him. I can't believe this is happening. Drink does make everything better and the conversation will flow easier, but I don't know if it's going to be to the extent that they need to agree on a ranking. He's such an asshole. I love it. Well, he's been drinking Tokiyomi's wine. No way. He has wine in his collection. So insane. Why is Iris so angry? She's like, we're meant to fight? Or. That's his claim to being the best. He has the best things, and they all belong to him. Yeah. Fair. I don't think Gilgamesh has any wants. I think he just wanted the Grail because he didn't want anyone else to get it. There's the claim to being the oldest myth in the world. I mean, compared to everyone else. So even if he doesn't know about it, it's his. You get it? Well, I think it's a bit different to casters. Like, you gotta give it to him. It may be like an asshole way of logic, but it is, you know, a kind of logic. Here we go. A grail or two. What saver thinking? What morals? It's divine right, basically. That's his philosophy. Okay, Ryder seems to approve, so. Also historically true. Right, so yeah, Gilgamesh is more like whatever I say is the law and should be obeyed. Well, that was a quick dialogue. Just like, oh, okay, I guess we gotta fight then. I thought it would have been like a bottomless wine bottle. Man, Saber has been incredibly quiet. Big dramatic gulp. Even Gilgamesh wants to know. For world domination. Oh my god. Huddersfield. Right. So he needs to take on his own body again, because right now he's just kind of a spirit. Okay. Man, with all the wonders of modern weaponry at his disposal too. He has no fear. I mean, Ryder and Gilgamesh have very similar outlooks on what a king should be like. Saber's gonna like whoop them both. Something about being selfless. That's changing the course of history, though. It's noble phantasm. So he's trying to like make Ryder like reveal his noble phantasm. It's by sacrificing Assassin. Yeah, that would be my objection as well. Because that will have consequences that stretch way beyond Britain. I mean, Britain still exists, just in a different form. Gilgamesh. Oh no, it's so bad, but also I kind of get it. Gilgamesh. Oh, that's one way to look at it. it's like a king should not have regrets. You do what you do and then you suffer the consequences no matter what. And Gilgamesh is like, why would you be sad over the deaths of people who are below you? Such an asshole. Oh. Oh, but I guess, yeah, especially in Alexander's time, I guess he kind of needed a tyrant to be able to accomplish the great things that he did. Yeah. At least they provided direction and like one rule. Oh, that's right. Like his generals that came afterwards. Yeah, so he's not sad, but he's like, that's just how the cards went. I love Saber so much, but oh man. She's a bit one track. That's an incredibly high standard. Like, it's almost like she's not human. I mean, she isn't, but even as a king, she wasn't. Oh, that's not right either. God, he's really ripping into her. Because he's saying she's not relatable. So if you live life to the full, then your people are inspired by that. Do everything to the extreme. Unlike Saber, who was so good and noble that she distanced herself from her people. Battle of Camlin. You save them, but you never let them. Where I feel is kind of being a bit unfair though. She seems pretty shocked by his words too. He's still laughing. So condescending. Oh my god. He wants to collect her. Jeez. Yeah. Okay, we will definitely have like an hour long conversation about the conversation that just happened. Even Gilgamesh has like standards, like honor. Just finishing off his wine. Just wants to make the party bigger. Oh, well. How dare. His shirt. It's gonna ride all over them again? Like he did with Castor's vines? Hey, back in his king clothes. He's gonna call in his men? Like his army? Like his comrades? Oh, this is like his homeland. Bloody marble. Wait, so he just took them into the desert. Right, so this is the legend of King Alexander who fought alongside his men, right? Like the legendary, king whom his men loved. Oh my god. That's awesome music. And his crazy eyes. Ionian Hertoi. Oh my god. Oh shit. He has an army of servants at his call and beckon. Oh man, I feel like this bolsters his claim to like being at the top of the rank quite well. Oh, he like embodies the life force of all his soldiers. That's actually freaking awesome. Oh my gosh, they're just gonna totally massacre them. Unfortunately for you. Oh my gosh, they're just gonna get sliced to little bits. Oh shit, this is absolutely brutal. Wait, can he only call on this noble phantasm once? I feel like this would be way OP if he could just do this at a whim. Oh, oh man, Saber. It's just like, is she thinking my men or my knights would never have done that for me like that? Not in that way. Oh, he has cut her off from like the community of kings. Oh shit. Oh, that is gonna cut so bad. I don't. I understand Iskandar's concept of a king, but I also feel like he's not fully taking into account King Arthur's situation. Eh? Eh? I did not expect that from him. Is he on some level actually impressed? It's so hard to tell with him, like, because he's still laughing at her, but also he admires her in a weird way, just like her conviction of being a sacrifice for her kingdom. Hey, oh, was that Lancelot? Oh, she looks so defeated. I feel like maybe there are different kings who are suited for different time periods. Like, because King Arthur, he ruled during an age of the chivalric code and where it was all about virtue and honor. And so maybe her style of leading just suited that sort of culture. On the other hand, you know, King Alexander, like his claim to fame really was that he caused, you know, the people to love him. Even the people that he conquered, he wasn't like a full-on tyrant where he would absolutely slaughter everyone, all his former enemies. He would actually allow their cultures to flourish and through more diplomatic means win them over to him, which is, I guess, why his noble phantasm is bunches of armies and of spiders who love him because they see in Alexander all of their hopes and dreams and everything that you can be, except maxed out. And so they're like, this is someone that I could follow because that is something that I aspire to. Oh god, or a Saber's just like standing alone in a field of dead soldiers. With her ideals intact, but maybe not necessarily like their loyalty. With no one right beside her. That is so fascinating. Oh man, we definitely have to like just like pass every single line of that dialogue when they're sitting around drinking wine because there's a part of me that is like, wait, there's something weird about what Alexander is saying. Like I feel like Saber has a point as well. Like it's not like Alexander is completely right in his assessment of her being completely unsuited to be a king. Okay, let me think about it and I'll come back and sort of discuss more. And definitely this is like an episode where I'm looking forward to just reading all the good comments and the essays that people hopefully are going to write on their thoughts, because there must be just a million ways to read this. All right, let's talk about the talk. And it's the next morning now, but I'm sure as more days go by that new things will come to me because I'm still mulling over it in my head. But the two, I guess, main buckets of knowledge I felt that we got from that whole discussion was first is what kind of king that Archer, Ryder, and Saber are or were. And then the second being the more normative judgment of that first thing, which requires thinking about which type of king is the better type. And in terms of what kinds of kings each of them are, and by that what we're really looking at is, well, are the philosophies by which they rule and how they think about what is right and wrong. I think Gilgamesh is the most straightforward. Okay, just quick recap.
でもな、じゃあ、貴様別段聖杯が惜しいってわけでもないんだろう。
無論だ。だが俺の財を狙う族には叱るべき裁きを下さねばならぬ。要は筋道の問題だ。
つまり何なんだ、じゃあ。
Saber's side eye was so strong in this
どんな
conversation.
道理があると。
法だ。俺が王として敷いた俺の法だ。
完璧だな。
Okay, so basically, to Gilgamesh, whatever he wants and says goes. Like anything that comes out of his mouth is the law and must be obeyed. It's pretty straightforward. He sets himself way above any other being or subject. And that is why also any treasure of value, including the Holy Grail, even though he hasn't heard of it or knows what it is, automatically belongs to him because of this super elevated position and because of his stature in the line of mythological beings and kings. I guess that is the biggest difference between him and the other two. Gilgamesh is above his subjects and just untouchable. Iskander puts himself on a sort of a similar level to his subjects. Like he rules over them for sure, but he's also being relatable by inspiring them to be like him and to love him and to see him as this ideal that they're striving for. Whereas Saber, so Gilgamesh is up here, Iskander is down here, and then Saber's puts herself beneath her subjects. She is like the embodiment of the servant king who sacrifices and suffers for those that she rules over. Okay, so as to which approach is better, like above your subjects, on a similar level to your subjects, or below your subjects, instinctively, I think it depends on historical context, and there are pros and cons to each. Obviously, I, speaking from the 21st century and living in a Western democratic nation, would tend more towards Saber's view of things, that rulers should rule in service of their people. But that is only because we've had like centuries of political development that slowly grinded and trended painfully towards representative government. But in Gilgamesh's time, for example, we're talking ancient Sumerian time, where kings were believed to be literal gods. So it makes sense that Gilgamesh would hold his views. When we get to Alexander the Great, which is like, I think it was 3rd or 4th century BC, it was like the age of empires and of the classical Greek states, politics by then and populations had become a lot more complex. And as a ruler, it wasn't enough to just impose your iron rule on everyone, on these large sprawling populations. There was also like a certain amount of having to appeal to the masses and using diplomacy to achieve your political ends. Also, Iskander's idea of a king needing to live life to the max or to the extreme in order to be an ideal for the people to hold and esteem and strive for really just totally embodies the Aristotelian ideal of it's like eudaimonia, which is this idea of attaining pleasure for its own sake and not for any sort of utilitarian ends. Unlike King Arthur, you get to King Arthur, who's a bit later, 5th or 6th century AD. And the prevailing system then was like medieval adherence to these very rigid religious and moral and chivalric codes of conduct that rewarded knightly ideals like honor and sacrifice and piety. So in contrast, then it was like denial of pleasure was the name of the game. So Saber embodying those ideals also makes sense. So to watch the three of them criticize each other for their philosophy on what the ideal king should be like was really interesting. There's not a straightforward right answer in my view. As is the case with these sorts of questions, the right answer is very like context specific. The way that the dialogue was written, especially the confrontation between Saber and Ryder, seemed to paint Ryder's view in the more positive light, with Saber being the contrite one being taught a lesson or something. And because she, by the end of it, seemed just crushed by Ryder's disparaging of her as a king. So that was weird for me because I don't necessarily agree with where the conclusion seemed to land, i.e. that Iskandar is right about Saber. Okay, this bit.
それこそが王の本懐だろ
で、王たる貴様は正したの奴隷か。
それでいい。理想に準じてこそ王だ。
そんな生き方は人ではない。
王として国を治めるのなら、人の生き方など望めない。
That was a great line.
征服王。たかだか我が身の可愛さのあまりに、聖杯を求めるという貴様にはわかるまい。
But I think she doesn't understand that Alexander is only living his life to the full for the sake of his people.
セイバーよ、理想に準じると貴様は言ったな。なるほど、往年の貴様は清廉にして潔白な聖者であったことだろう。さぞや高貴でおかしがたい姿であったことだろう。だがな、殉教などという茨の道に一体誰が憧れる？
Yeah, okay. Alright, so I guess, it seemed like Ryder's main criticisms of Saber is that one, she shouldn't want to change her mark on history by wanting to use the Grail to save Britain again and I guess erase how it was invaded and overtaken by the Anglo-Saxons. And two, that by her clinging on to her ideals of honor and justice with no flexibility, by denying herself the normal pleasures of a normal person for the sake of being this shining exemplar of a king, she ended up cutting herself off from her people or her knights, who, being normal people themselves, could never relate to her perfection. I think that's the gist. There was another line that he says later, which is like, you saved them, but you never led them. And I found that line to be odd. Again, I've got to think about it more. I do think that there is something in that criticism because just going by one of the more popular readings of the Arthurian legend, what led to King Arthur's downfall apparently was his deliberate ignorance of the affair that was going on between Lancelot and Guinevere, because so great was his clinging on to his ideals of honor and the loyalty that should exist between a king and their knight that he didn't want to acknowledge it and deal with it. And so that led to this festering of dissent and divide amongst the Knights of the Round Table, which, as we said before, led to the breakdown of the kingdom. So I guess I could see sort of Ryder's reasoning there. However, in relation to his first criticism that as king, Saber shouldn't have any regrets and not want to change the course of history, I thought that was slightly rich coming from him because he too actually is wanting the Grail so that he can be reincarnated and then finish off his conquest of the world that he never got to finish. because to me, like, that is in a sense rewriting history as well, just in another way. It's like, it's a desire that shows that he still feels like he had unfinished business, or that he wishes that he'd done more during his lifetime. What was super fascinating to me at the end of that conversation was how Gilgamesh, though he didn't side with Saber, did tell her in his own way that she wasn't completely wrong and she should just keep doing what she's doing. Because I think it was the fact that her conviction to her ideals got to him. And I think that is the future Gilgamesh sort of peeking out from underneath, because again, going back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, it was only after he'd gone through lots of trials and lost his best friend Enkidu that Gilgamesh really mellowed out and sort of became a ruler with actual morals. So his struggle was with the seeming meaninglessness of human life. And so to see someone like Saber cling so strongly to these moral ideals that do give meaning and purpose to a life, that, you know, your actions and your character actually matter, that to Gilgamesh is something to admire. So yeah, I'm definitely going to have to mull on all of this a lot longer. Please hit me with your comments, because I'd love to read different viewpoints on this. I'm just so happy that they gave us such a meaty conversation between these three kings that really covered such a massive ground in terms of the different philosophical approaches to kingship and to politics, and really to like the core of what is ethically or morally right to do. So yeah, that was fascinating. And that's where we'll end today. I look forward to reading your thoughts. My own thoughts may very well do a complete 180 by the next time we're sitting down and watching more Fate Zero. So yeah, until then, guys, take care and have a good rest of the day or night.